The day my father tore that letter in half, something in me went very, very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that heals you. The kind that tells you, okay, okay, you are completely on your own now. I was 16 years old, standing in the middle of our kitchen, and the pieces of that MIT acceptance letter were floating down to the linoleum floor like two little white flags of surrender. Except they weren't my surrender. They were his. My name is Lily Rose, and I grew up in a house where the rules were very simple. Do what Dad says, or don't do anything at all. My father was not a cruel man in the traditional sense. He didn't yell every day. He didn't throw things. He worked at the same manufacturing plant for 22 years, came home smelling like metal shavings and cigarette smoke, and sat in the same recliner every single night, watching the same sports channel until he fell asleep with the remote still in his hand. He was, by every external measure, a steady man, a provider. But there is a kind of control that doesn't need to raise its voice. It just waits. It watches what you love and makes a note of it. And then when the moment is exactly right, it uses that thing, that one precious thing, to remind you of your place. My place, according to my father, was 2 miles down the road at the community college, maybe a nursing program, something practical, something that kept me close to home, manageable, visible, something that cost less than a car and required absolutely none of his pride to swallow. MIT was not that. MIT was a dream I had been quietly building for 3 years inside the walls of my bedroom, between 8 o'clock curfews and mandatory family dinners, in the kind of suffocating smallness that I think only people who grew up in certain households will truly understand when I describe it. I wasn't just smart. I don't want to sound arrogant about it, but I worked. I worked in a way that I think genuinely frightened my father, because he had no framework for it. He didn't come from people who worked that way, and what he couldn't understand, he couldn't control. I applied to MIT without telling him. I applied late at night after everyone was asleep, using the school computer, because I was afraid that if I said the words out loud in that house, the dream would dissolve before it ever had the chance to become real. I asked my guidance counselor, Mrs. Patricia Hensley, bless that woman, to be my contact for any correspondence. I wrote my essays in 30-minute windows when the house was empty. I submitted my application on a Tuesday in November, and then walked home through the cold and told absolutely no one. The letter came on a Friday in late March. I know the exact date because I have thought about it almost every week for the last 8 years. March 23rd. The day everything became real and then immediately became ruins within the span of about 4 minutes. Mrs. Hensley called me to her office during third period. She was smiling, not the kind of smile she used when she had something hard to tell you, but the real kind, the kind that makes the outer corners of a person's eyes crinkle up without them even meaning for it to happen. She slid the envelope across her desk and said, "I think you should open this yourself." I don't remember what the letter said word for word. I remember the word congratulations. I remember that my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to put the paper flat on her desk to finish reading it. I remember Mrs. Hensley crying before I did, which struck me as one of the most generous things a person had ever done for me. She cried, then she hugged me and she said, "Lily, this is everything you've been working for." I went home that afternoon, with the letter folded carefully in the inside pocket of my jacket, right against my chest, like it was a living thing that needed to stay warm. I made a mistake. I told him. I don't know what I was hoping for. I think on some level, and I've spent a lot of time in therapy working through this, so I'm not going to be embarrassed about saying it. I think some part of me believed that the letter itself would change things, that if the proof was physical, was real, was stamped and official and signed by an admissions office at one of the most respected institutions in the world, my father would look at it and see me differently, would see that I was someone worth being proud of. I handed it to him at the kitchen table. He read it. I watched his eyes move across the page, and then he set it down, and he looked at me, and he said something I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, "Who put this idea in your head?" Not congratulations, not even a simple acknowledgement that something significant had occurred. Just that, a cold, flat assumption that I couldn't have wanted this on my own. that someone must have tampered with me. I told him no one put it in my head. I told him I had worked for it. I told him it was a full merit scholarship consideration, that the financial piece was something we could work through together, that I had already started researching. He picked the letter up off the table. He tore it down the middle, then he tore those pieces in half again. He set them on the edge of the table like they were nothing, like they were a grocery receipt, like they were junk mail, stood up from his chair, rinsed his plate in the sink, and walked back to his recliner. That was the entire conversation. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. I didn't cry right away. The tears came later, privately, the way they always did in that house. What I felt in that moment was something closer to the experience of watching a door lock from the inside, a soft final click, and then silence. Here is something nobody tells you about surviving a moment like that. You don't dramatically fall apart. You don't have some cinematic breakdown. You just keep going, because you don't have any other option. The next morning, you get up, you brush your teeth, you go to school, you eat lunch, you do your homework. The world continues at exactly the same pace it always has, completely indifferent to the fact that something in you has permanently changed. What changed for me was this. I stopped waiting for permission. That shift was quiet, and it took time, and it wasn't clean or graceful in the way that personal transformations are sometimes portrayed. I was still living in my father's house. I still followed his rules because I was 16 and had no real alternative. But something had relocated inside me, moved from a place that faced outward toward him, hoping, toward a place that faced only forward. I stopped wanting his approval. I started wanting my own. I graduated high school at 17. I did not apply to the community college 2 miles down the road. I applied to 3 universities with strong financial aid programs, wrote what I honestly believe were the best personal essays of my life, because I had something real to write about, and got into all 3. I chose a university 4 states away. I told my father 2 weeks before I left. I had already accepted the offer, already arranged my housing, already packed most of what I owned into 2 duffel bags and a plastic tote. He didn't tear anything up that time. He just said I was making a mistake, and then he went back to his recliner. I left on a Sunday in late August with those 2 duffel bags and a one-way bus ticket that I had saved for 3 months to afford. College was hard in the way that I think it's specifically hard for people who don't have a financial net under them. I worked through school in the way that people don't always fully visualize when they hear the phrase, "I worked my way through college," because it sounds romantic, like a montage. But the reality is that it means you're eating vending machine dinners at 11 o'clock at night after a 6-hour shift at whatever job you strung together that semester, and then opening your laptop and writing a paper anyway, because if you don't finish the paper, you lose the grade, and if you lose the grade, you lose the scholarship stipend, and if you lose the stipend, you have to call someone at home for help, and that is not an option. I waitressed, I tutored, I did data entry. For one particularly strange semester, I helped a professor catalog old academic journals for a digitization project, which paid almost nothing, but gave me access to the university library at odd hours and let me work in comfortable silence, which I valued as much as the money. I graduated in 4 years with a degree in computer engineering. I remember the graduation ceremony primarily as a moment of logistical relief. It was done. I had finished. The thing that had seemed impossible when I was standing in that kitchen with torn paper at my feet was now, technically, complete. My mother came. She sat in the bleachers and waved at me from across the field and cried, and I waved back, and I loved her for being there. And I didn't look for my father in the crowd because I already knew he wasn't in it. The years that followed graduation were a different kind of hard. Not the desperate survival mode hard of college, but the quieter, more disorienting hard of building an actual life from scratch when you don't have connections or capital or anyone at home who understands the industry you're trying to break into. I got my first real job at a mid-sized tech company on the strength of a portfolio project I had built alone in my apartment over the course of 8 months. It wasn't a flashy job. It wasn't glamorous. But it was mine, and the paycheck had my name on it, and every time direct deposit hit my account, I felt something that I can only describe as a very private, quiet defiance. I lived carefully. I know that sounds boring, and I'll be honest with you, it was sometimes boring. When you grow up not having things, you develop a relationship with money that is very different from people who didn't. I tracked every dollar. I saved aggressively. I wasn't miserly or joyless about it, but I was deliberate. Every financial choice I made was made with the awareness that I had no fallback. No one was going to catch me. I had to be my own safety net, and safety nets are built thread by thread. I climbed, slowly, then faster. I changed companies twice, once for a significant pay increase, once for a role that genuinely scared me a little, which I took as the primary sign that it was the right move. I built skills. I built a reputation in a fairly specific niche. I invested in myself in the ways that mattered. Courses, certifications, mentors, the kind of relationships with colleagues that eventually become the framework of an actual career. By 28, I was earning more money in a year than my father had earned in 5. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because the number mattered to me in a way that I had to think carefully about, because I didn't want it to matter in the wrong way. I didn't want to be a person who measures their worth in dollars as a reaction to childhood, who chases income as a substitute for the approval they never got. That's a trap. I'd seen people fall into it, and the landing is not gentle. So I did something that I think was, in a small way, the beginning of turning all of it into something that actually meant something. Like a dream she wasn't allowed to take seriously. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about a 16-year-old standing in a kitchen with torn paper on the floor. I said, tell her to apply to everything she wants to apply to, all of it, and tell her I'm handling it. Maya got very quiet. Then she said, Lily. I said, I mean it. I've been waiting for something to do with all this, and I think this is it. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to tell this story in a way that makes me sound heroic or self-sacrificing, because that's not what it was. It was not a noble gesture. It was not charity in the cold, institutional sense of the word. It was something much more personal and much less tidy than that. It was the thing I couldn't do for myself at 16, finally becoming possible, except this time, for someone I loved. I called an education financial advisor. I sat down and looked at my actual numbers with real honesty, which is something I recommend to everyone regardless of the circumstances, because most of us have more flexibility than our anxiety tells us we do, and some of us have significantly less. And either way, it's better to know. I figured out what I could genuinely commit to, not in a burst of generosity that collapses later way, but in a real, sustainable, multi-year commitment that I could stand behind, regardless of what happened in my own career in the interim. Then I called Sophie directly. She was 15, and she was polite and slightly formal the way teenagers sometimes are, with adults they don't see often. And I told her what I had told her mother, and there was a silence on the line that I recognized from the inside out. It was the silence of someone being told they're allowed to want something. I said, Sophie, I need you to hear this clearly. You apply to every school you want to apply to. You apply to the ones that feel too big, and the ones that feel impossible, and the ones that are so far from here geographically that your brain starts making up reasons why it would never work. You apply to all of them, and you write the most honest application essays you have ever written in your life. And then you let me worry about the rest. She said very quietly, why? And I said, because someone should have done this for me. There was another silence. Sophie applied to 11 universities. She was accepted to 7. Of those 7, the one she ultimately chose was a program in biomedical engineering at a university that had, for her, carried the same weight that MIT had carried for me at her age. Enormous, slightly unreal, almost mythological in its distance from her daily life. She chose it, and I was there. I want to tell you what that morning felt like. The morning I transferred the first tuition payment, because it was one of the most unexpectedly emotional moments of my adult life, and I was completely unprepared for it. I had done the practical thing. I had set up the account. I had confirmed all the details with the university's financial office. It was administrative. It was paperwork. I had my coffee. I was at my kitchen table. I was wearing pajamas. Nothing about the setting was remotely significant. And then I clicked confirm, and something happened in my chest that I do not have perfect words for. It was not triumph exactly. It was not closure exactly. It was something more like completion, like a sentence that had been missing its final word for 8 years had just, quietly, finished itself. I sat there in my pajamas, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried in a long time. Not the way I cried in that kitchen at 16. Those tears were hot and desperate and full of the specific grief of a child who has just learned something hard about a parent. These tears were different, calmer, older, the kind that come when something genuinely good happens and you've waited long enough for it that you'd almost forgotten what it would feel like. I thought about Mrs. Hensley, who I should really send a letter to and keep meaning to. I thought about all the vending machine dinners, and the one-way bus ticket, and the portfolios built alone in small apartments. I thought about every moment I had kept going, not because it was easy, but because the alternative, stopping, settling, shrinking back down to fit the shape of what someone else had decided I should be, was simply not something I was willing to do. I thought about my father. Here's where I want to be honest with you, because this story would be very easy to tell in a way that ends with something clean and theatrical. Reconciliation, a phone call, a deathbed moment, an apology. That is not my story. My father and I have a relationship now that I would describe as cautious. We speak at holidays. We are civil. Several years ago, he said something to me, in a sideways, face-saving way, that I recognized as the closest he was going to get, that amounted to acknowledging that I had done well for myself. It wasn't an apology. It was not the conversation I might have scripted for myself in my 20s when I was still working through a lot of anger. But I have come to accept it as what it is, the most he is capable of, given who he is, given the kind of man his own life made him. I have made peace with that. Not easily, not completely, not without a lot of work, but genuinely. Because holding on to the wound was costing me something I couldn't afford to keep spending. And because I found something better to do with the energy. Sophie is a sophomore now. She calls me more than I expected, which is one of the genuinely lovely surprises of this whole thing. She tells me about her classes, about professors who challenge her, about a research assistant position she recently applied for that would allow her to work in a lab doing actual tissue engineering work as a second-year student, which strikes me as extraordinary. She tells me when things are hard, which I take as real trust, and I try to respond the way I wish someone had responded to me. Not with answers, not with platitudes, but with genuine acknowledgement that hard is real, and hard is not the same as impossible. She sent me a photo last semester, just a casual one, taken by a friend, of her standing outside one of the science buildings on campus. She's squinting a little against the sun. She's carrying a backpack that's clearly too heavy. She's smiling. I printed that photo, and it's sitting on my desk right now, next to my coffee mug. Some days, the ones where work is frustrating, or the world feels heavy, or I'm tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. I look at that photo, and I think, this is the thing. This is what the bus ticket, and the vending machine dinners, and the portfolio, and every careful, deliberate, quiet, persistent choice we're building toward. Not a career, not a salary, not a number in an account. This. A kid who is allowed to want what she wants. A kid who doesn't have to wait. I know that there are people listening to this right now who are sitting in some version of the kitchen I was in at 16. Maybe you're 15. Maybe you're 35. Maybe the person holding the letter is a partner or an employer or a voice inside your own head that has absorbed someone else's limitations so completely that it has started to feel like your own. I know what that kitchen feels like, how still and total the silence is after that door locks. I also know that locks are not permanent. I know that a torn letter is not the same as a torn dream, because a dream is not paper. You cannot hold it in your hands and rip it down the middle. It does not flutter to the floor. It lives somewhere quieter and more durable than that, and it will wait for you, with extraordinary patience, for as long as it takes. 8 years is not nothing. 8 years of work and strategy and learning to be your own safety net and making peace with the parts of your story you can't change. That is not nothing. But I want to tell you that 8 years later, I was sitting at my kitchen table in my pajamas, and something that felt broken was whole. Not fixed, not erased. Whole in the way that things that have been through something real are whole, with the mark of it still visible, but standing. I am still standing. And my niece Sophie is standing too, 4 states away, outside a science building she chose herself, squinting into the sun. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is everything. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments below. I always love knowing. Has someone ever tried to tear up your dream, and what did you do next? If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. Lily Calm Stories drops new narrations every week, and there are a lot more real, quiet, true stories still to tell.